Welcome, everyone, to the third lecture in the 2025 to 2026 lecture series hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers Law School. This year's lecture series is entitled Free Speech and Racial Equality. And I am delighted to be hosting Professor Mohammad Fadel from the University of Toronto in Canada to give a talk on his latest article, Beyond Liberal Zionism, International Law, Political Liberalism, and the Possibility of a Just Zionism. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I want to encourage everyone to visit the Center for Security, Race, and Rights website at csrr.rutgers.edu and to follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR, RUCSRR, on all the various social media platforms. And if you are a podcast listener, subscribe to the Race and Rights podcast, which I have the privilege of hosting, and be sure to also watch our past lectures on the CSRR YouTube channel. Now, this year's lecture series is intentionally entitled Free Speech and Racial Equality because this is a point in history, in American history, where free speech is directly under attack and under assault by various members of the government, elected officials, and even universities. And the group that has been, or the groups that have been most harmed, most directly harmed by these assaults on free speech in ways that are very un-American and contrary to the spirit of the First Amendment free speech clause and political assembly clauses, has been Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs and their allies. And their allies include Jewish Americans, Hindu Americans, Christian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, white Americans. But what we are finding is that the pretext and the justification for violating free speech and political freedom rights in a very systematic way by the government and universities and law firms and employers has been based on the vilification in the perpetuation of racial tropes that Palestinians are terrorists, that Muslims and Arabs are terrorists, that Palestinians are presumptively anti-Semitic, and Arabs and Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic. All of these are racist tropes intended to justify discrimination against these groups, justify vilifying them or deporting them or harming them in their employment and in their physical safety. So I think it's very important that we identify who the canary in the mine is, right? Who is essentially the first target or the first victim of these assaults on free speech, and be sure that we first don't allow that to happen, but also that we understand that eventually all of us will be impacted and will be harmed when we do not have free speech rights, when we do not have academic freedom rights. So if you find the work of the center informative, if you find it helpful, if you find it illuminating, even if you don't agree with all the views expressed, which again is your right in a democratic, free-thinking society, but if you find it informative, please consider making a financial donation to the center. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and please give generously. Now, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our featured guest today, Professor Mohammad Fadel, who is a full professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where he has taught since 2006. His research explores Islamic law and political thought with particular attention to questions of sovereignty, human rights, liberalism, and comparative constitutionalism. Professor Fadel has published widely in leading journals, including the Virginia Journal of International Law, American Journal of Comparative Law, Journal of Islamic Ethics, and Emory International Law Review. Professor Fadel received his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago and his JD from the University of Virginia. His scholarly work bridges legal history, international law, and political theory, and he is frequently cited for his contributions to debates on the role of Islamic law in modern governance and its relationships to liberal democracy. And in today's lecture, he will be basing his remarks and his analysis on his latest law review article entitled Beyond Liberal Zionism, quote, or colon, International Law, Political Liberalism, and the Possibility of a Just Zionism, which I encourage everyone to read, and it is available for free online. And so with that, thank you so much, Professor Fadel. Ya marhaba bik. Welcome to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Aziz, for this really generous introduction, and thank you for putting together this lecture series. I hope I can speak adequately in the time allotted to me. It's a very long paper, but basically, the idea is to try to evaluate actually existing Zionism, by which I mean the tradition of political Zionism that successfully created the Jewish state known today as Israel, against the normative requirements of political liberalism. And, for this purpose, I'm generally using the framework that John Rawls adopts in trying to determine the justice of political Zionism and what would be required of political Zionism for it to satisfy the criteria of liberal justice. Okay, so the first thing to do this is we need to sort of start off from what is the actual position of Zionism, political Zionism, vis-a-vis Palestinians. So anybody who spends any time reading about the history of political Zionism and its institutions comes quickly to understand that it has an exclusivist character, by which we mean that Zionists of all stripes believe that Palestine, or the land of Israel, because in some versions and many versions, the land of Israel includes Palestine, but also other territories, is the exclusive property of the Jewish people. In fact, a Jewish scholar at Harvard named Shaul Magid, who we might call a post-Zionist thinker, calls this proprietary Zionism, a conception of which he is very critical, rightly so. So now even within the concept of proprietary Zionism, there is a wide range of opinion among Zionists about what to do about the fact that lots of non-Jews live in the land of Israel, right? So there's a spectrum. Some believe in expulsion. Apparently, some believe in literal liquidation if they're not cooperating in leaving. Others advocate a more sort of humane treatment of Palestinians, of non-Jews in the land of Israel. But the most important feature that is in common among all different strands of Zionism, political Zionism, is that Zionist claims are prior, right? Non-Jews do not have any, what we could call from constitutional theory, constituent power. Whatever rights that they have in the land of Israel are granted to them by Jews. So from this perspective, Arabs in the land of Israel are a moral crisis for Jews. It's like, if you could say, it's a moral test, right? So Jews might disagree about what Jewish ethics requires in respect to treatment of non-Jews, in this case, Arabs, but Arabs have no voice, or non-Jews have no voice in determining what the terms of social cooperation and political cooperation would be. So from a Rawlsian perspective, Rawls would call political Zionism a rational doctrine, rational meaning that it exists to fulfill the interests of a certain group of people, but it's not reasonable. So a reasonable doctrine is a doctrine that is prepared to offer fair terms of cooperation to others, right? It takes others as equal political beings, and so therefore only offers terms of cooperation that they believe another, viewed as an equal, would reasonably be prepared to accept, right? So Zionism is rational insofar as it seeks to further the interests of Jews as a collectivity, but it's not reasonable because it does not deem non-Jews to be politically equal to them, and therefore there's no need to take into account their interests in formulating the terms of the basic social contract. Now, there is a certain strand of Zionism which is called liberal Zionism, and insofar as they view themselves as liberal, there's a certain tension between their liberalism and their Zionism, given Zionism's exclusivist character. So the question is, how do they go about justifying their sort of view of Israel as a legitimate state. Well, I think what they do, and they may not necessarily do this explicitly, oftentimes it's just an assumption, is they treat Palestine as though it's a terra nullius. A terra nullius in international law is a piece of territory that belongs to no one, right? It's sort of in a state of nature. It's not subject to any law. There are no entitlements there. And this is kind of vulgarly encapsulated in the Zionist slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. It's not as though Zionists thought that the Palestine was literally empty. It's just that they believed that those people had no rights as a collective group of people, right? Or that they had no political rights. They were kind of existing in the state of nature. And so building a polity in that territory does them no wrong because they are, for lack of a better term, a pre-political people. They have no political rights. They just sort of exist the way the natural world exists. Now, I would say that the greatest success of Zionism, from an ideological perspective, has been to erase from public consciousness the relevance of public international law to the status of Palestine and the rights of Arabs as citizens of Palestine prior to the creation of the State of Israel. So you will notice that most discussions of Palestine proceed on what might call natural rights grounds. So they're disputing narratives about who has a greater right in natural law to Palestine. Is it Jews because Jews had a kingdom supposedly in Palestine in late antiquity? Is it the Arabs because they've been there since, the turn of the millennium, the first millennium, around the days of Christ and the late Roman Empire, Islam, etc., continual occupation. So these are dueling claims, one might say, of natural law, right? And you can't adjudicate dueling claims of natural law because there's nothing in common between them. And that becomes I think, a success for Zionism when people debate it in that language, right? Because if there are incommensurate views, then, well, all that's left is arms, right? But in fact, there is public international law, right? And so I argue that if one is a committed liberal in the Rawlsian sense, one has to take the baseline in thinking about the equities of this conflict. You have to adopt the baseline the public international law provides. So what does public international law tell us about Palestine? Palestine came into existence as a juridical entity as part of the settlement of World War I. Right? The evidence for this is overwhelming. If one looks at the covenant of the League of the League of Nations, in particular Article 22, it recognizes the provisional independence of all the new states that were going to be created out of the Ottoman Empire. Right? It says expressly that the territories of the Ottoman Empire, all they need is sort of technical assistance to achieve independence, and it expressly recognizes their right to independence provisionally, right? The Treaty of Lausanne, which ended the state of war between the Allies and the Republic of Turkey as successor to the Ottoman Empire, expressly contemplates the creation of independent states out of the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. And we see that the mandatory states, including Palestine, were recognized as independent juridical persons in the interwar period. The best evidence for Palestine's existence as an independent juridical entity is the fact that it was a defendant in a lawsuit in front of the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1924, the Mavromatis Palestine Concessions. It's obvious that only states can be defendants in the Permanent Court of International Justice, now the International Court of Justice, right? So Palestine, indisputably, had an independent, had a distinct legal personality in international law. Well, did the mandate change any of this? No. The mandate took for granted that Palestine was a state in being. Yes, a state not independent, subject to a mandatory power, but an independent juridical entity distinct from that of the mandatory power, right? Although the mandatory power was duty-bound to establish a Jewish national home, it also had to establish institutions of self-governance for the inhabitants of Palestine, and it had to ensure that the Jewish national home did not endanger the civil and religious rights of the inhabitants of Palestine. There are various other provisions of the mandate that confirm the integrity of Palestine as its own separate state. For example, the mandatory had to guarantee the territorial integrity of Palestine. It had to facilitate Jewish immigration, but without any sort of prejudice to the interests of the other sections of the population. It had to adopt a nationality law, which it did, and obviously it granted citizenship to the Arabs of Palestine, who were by far the overwhelming majority of Palestine. Any kind of variation in the terms of the mandate had to be approved by the Council of the League of Nations. Great Britain could not unilaterally transform the terms of the mandate into a license to create a Zionist state. Okay, so as I said, Great Britain, in its capacity as mandatory, promulgated a nationality law. What did that nationality law say? Well, it granted all people who had been formerly Turkish citizens or Ottoman citizens and habitually resident in the territory that became Palestine, it granted them Palestinian citizenship under the principle of ipso facto citizenship, which is a rule of public international law, right? Any kind of Palestinians who were abroad, let's say they were in America, trying to make a living, right? They were given 2 years to apply for Palestinian citizenship. And there were finally naturalization provisions. So it allowed for Jews and also Arabs to immigrate to Palestine and become citizens of Palestine if they lived in Palestine for 2 of the 3 previous years prior to the application for citizenship, and they spoke either Arabic or Hebrew, right? When somebody became a naturalized citizen, they swore an oath of loyalty, quote, to the government of Palestine. And what kind of rights did a naturalized citizen get? They got all the political and other rights to which a natural-born Palestinian is entitled. So it's very clear that the mandate did not establish some sort of hierarchical citizenship between Jewish citizens on top and Arab citizens at the bottom. There was a principle of equal citizenship, and in fact, it was the citizenship of the natural-born citizen, i.e. the Arab, that was the baseline that the immigrant citizen was going to be sharing in. Well, after World War II was fought, the League of Nations was dissolved and the United Nations was established in its place, but the UN adopted and incorporated these provisions from the League of Nations, right? So if anything, it made the obligation set out in the covenant of the League of Nations and the Palestine Mandate even more secure and more firm. So if you look at the provisions of the UN Charter, there are very specific rules about mandated territories. Mandated territories only have 2 options. They either are granted independence in accordance with the terms of the mandate, or they are replaced by a trusteeship. And I think it's obvious that that didn't take place in the case of Palestine, right? In other words, Palestine's right to independence, its de jure right under public international law to independence with an Arab majority, was denied to it. Why was it denied to it? Because of the violence that the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was able to deploy successfully in 1947, 48, 49, in the wake of the failed partition plan. Now, many people seem to think that the partition plan authorized the creation of a Zionist state, but that's not actually true. If you read the terms of the partition plan, first of all, as a legal matter, it was only a suggestion. It wasn't a binding decision. So there was no legal wrong that the Arabs did by refusing the plan. There are a lot of reasons why the plan the Arabs rejected it. Not only the Arabs rejected it, Great Britain rejected it. Great Britain was still the mandatory, and if the mandatory power had accepted it, that would have been the end of the story from the perspective of public international law. But Great Britain itself refused to endorse the partition plan because it was so inequitable against the legitimate interests of the Arabs. But in any case, if you read the partition proposal, right, it contemplated not only specific territorial limits for what it called the Jewish state and the Arab state, and also this international city of of Jerusalem. It also required certain substantive requirements. It imposed on each one of these states a substantive obligation, for example, to adopt a liberal constitution that was adopted by a constituent assembly elected by all citizens. Okay? Now, bear in mind that the Jewish state contemplated by the partition plan would have had almost 50% Arab citizens. So not only did the partition plan require a liberal constitution, right? The constituent assembly would have been presumably represented by have a very substantial Arab representation. So the notion that the partition plan endorsed a Zionist state is kind of absurd on its face. Now, another common myth is that the Yishuv accepted the partition plan. This is sort of at best, a half-truth, because the Yishuv never accepted either the territorial limits of the partition plan, nor did they accept the substantive requirements of the partition plan. So they expanded well beyond the territory allotted to them. By the time they declared independence in May of 1948, they had already invaded many of the parts of Palestine that had been granted, at least in principle, to what would be the Arab state. They invaded Jerusalem, which was supposed to be an international city. They had already expelled 350,000 Arabs from the territory that fell under their control, right? So there was no good faith effort to create a constituent assembly that represented all the people of the territory allocated to the Jewish state. Instead, they expelled the non-Jewish population because this was consistent with Ben-Gurion's theory that a Jewish state required a supermajority of Jews. His view was it needed 4-to-1 Jews in order for it to be stable. Okay, so this is basically the origin story of Israel as it existed. It's a story of a political theory that requires ethnic domination because it rejects what Rawls would call reasonable cooperation with others. So what would a Jewish state or Zionism look like if it took Arab equality of citizenship seriously? That's kind of what I try to do at the end of in the last couple of sections of the paper. So instead of thinking about Zionism as a project of creating ethnic domination, demographic domination based on this ratio of 4-to-1 Jews to Arabs, right? Instead, one could break Zionism down into a set of distinct political demands, right? You could say, as Jews, as a collective of as a collective body, there are certain things that we need in order to flourish, right? And then we could think of those demands as some of them being consistent with the equality of non-Jews and some of them being inconsistent with the equality of non-Jews. And so political liberalism would say, okay, let's take the demands that are consistent with equality and we can incorporate them. Those that are not consistent with political equality will we can't enshrine into basic law, right? So what could be consistent? Like I argue that a moderate establishment of Judaism as religion would be consistent with the ideals of political liberalism. Maybe not perfectly so, like here in the United States, we are totally against the establishment of religion, but lots of liberal countries do have establishments, like England has the the establishment of the Church of England. Many European democracies have an established religion. One could imagine in Israel with an established form of Judaism. It's a mild form of establishment that doesn't require domination of non-Jews. So that could be incorporated in a just constitutional order. Arabic and Hebrew should be given equal status because the idea here is that the citizens of the state are both Arabs and are Arabic speakers and Hebrew speakers. And so both languages should be given equal status. You could also require recognition of Jewish holidays on an equal basis with Muslim and Christian holidays, but not giving priority to one over the other. You could even imagine that the constitutional order would create a special duty to grant asylum to Jews who are being persecuted for being Jewish, right? If the claim is, well, Jews are uniquely vulnerable around the world, and we need a place where Jews can go when they are being persecuted for being Jewish. So, okay, fine. That could be something that could be incorporated into the basic structure of the state that doesn't require the subordination of non-Jews. However, there are lots of things that would really need to be dismantled. And these are the sort of the fundamental features of what I call political Zionism, actually existing Zionism. At the top of the list is the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund is basically a trust that exists to acquire and administer land exclusively for the benefit of Jews. Right? So the paper talks about this in some detail, but to put it simplistically, it's the idea of the racially exclusionary covenant elevated to highest constitutional principle, right? So the Jewish National Fund administers something like 90% of the land in Israel, and it's done so exclusively for the benefit of Jews. Human Rights Watch details land use policy extensively in its report, A Threshold Crossed. It shows how in 70 years of the history of the state, basically no investment has been made in Arab towns or villages, right? So what I suggest is that the Jewish National Fund be dissolved and replaced with something called the Israeli National Fund. And in the Israeli National Fund, there would be equal representation of all the citizens, right? Now, of course, there's been 70 years of complete systematic neglect, so there would have to be remedial action taken to make up for the 70 years of non-investment in the Arab sector. But once you create this baseline of equality, it is not unlawful for a state to exercise the power of eminent domain, right? So what Israel did was it confiscated lands belonging to Arabs and then reserved it exclusively for the use of Jews. So that's clearly something that is, it's blatantly racially discriminatory. So that needs to be overcome by removing Jewish privilege, by getting rid of the Jewish National Fund and replacing it with a public national fund, right? Again, as I'm saying, it is legitimate for a state to expropriate private property so long as it does so for a public purpose, not just for the benefit of one section of the community. So that's one thing. Second thing, geographical segregation has to be brought to an end. Again, the Human Rights Watch report, A Threshold Crossed, makes very clear how Israeli policy is essentially to create a series of ghettos, isolated ghettos, and to confine Arab citizens within that. And that's closely connected to how the Jewish National Fund operates and restricts Arab access to land. So by dissolving the Jewish National Fund and making it non-discriminatory, then you can solve also this problem of segregation. Closely aligned to that is the principle of freedom of movement. So there needs to be freedom of movement for all citizens of Israel, right, or / Palestine. Education would need to be radically reformed by replacing nationalist education, which reinforces an exclusivist message of Palestine being the inheritance exclusively of Jews, with a civic education, which recognizes Palestine as a shared home, a shared space for people of diverse ethnicities and religions. And then a culture of bilingualism has to be promoted, right? So all children need to be educated equally in both Arabic and Hebrew, so that there is a sense that both languages are politically and socially equal. I don't want to keep talking because the paper, as I said, is quite long, and I am eager to hear your questions. I think one thing, just to say is that why write something like this? A friend of mine asked me, in the midst of the genocide, why write about, is it theoretically possible to have a just Zionism? Instead of just saying that Zionism must be dismantled. Well, I completely understand where that comes from. On the other hand, I also recognize, and I think it's important for everyone to recognize, that Palestine has to exist as a shared home for Arabs and Jews together. And so therefore, it's very important to visualize a future, a common future, right? Even if it seems utopian today, if we can think about what the terms of reasonable cooperation would be for a Palestine that is inclusive of everyone, then we can break down, I think, sort of the default support for political Zionism among many Jews, right? So that's what this paper is trying to do. It's trying to encourage particularly liberal Jews to realize that political Zionism is taking them in a direction, a very dark direction. But there is another way that goes forward that we could traverse together that would secure fundamental interests of Jews without leading to genocide. So I will stop here and hopefully open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Fadel. I would highly recommend that people, everyone in the audience, read his article, Beyond Zionism, International Law. Let me make sure I get the title right. International Law, Political Liberalism, and the Possibility of a Just Zionism, which was published in the Transnational Law and Contemporary Problems Law Journal. So you gave us a lot to think about, and I know that you only touched the surface of your law review article. One of the issues that Zionism has, or one of the challenges, and I would say harms that Zionism has caused in the U.S. context, has been the weaponization of anti-Semitism, specifically by conflating Zionism with Judaism, such that it sets up anyone who is critical of Zionism politically, intellectually, challenges the historical narrative of Zionism, is then silenced by being accused of hating Jews, right? Which oftentimes is done in very bad faith. So and I'll just put a pitch really quick to, we have a new issue brief that we just came out with in the Center for Security, Race and Rights, called Threats to Free Speech and Palestinian Civil Rights, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, because that has really been the tool that has been used to conflate Zionism with Judaism. So in your paper, and under the definition, that one of the examples is if someone were to state or believe politically that Israel is a racist endeavor, that would be an act of anti-Semitism that then could be the basis of an anti-discrimination lawsuit, that could be the basis of all sorts of adverse employment action and other kind of legal penalty. And you state on your paper on page 75, that Zionism cannot simply be labeled as a colonialist movement like European expansionism. And yet you do talk about kind of the colonialist theme or the colonialist objectives. And so could you expand on that? Could you explain to our audience how Zionism, what the relationship between Zionism and colonialism is as a intellectual concept and as a historical fact, and also to what extent it is similar or different than when we think of settler colonialism in the US, in Australia, or in other parts of the world?
Right. Okay, so Zionists often make the argument that Zionism can't be a colonial project because it wasn't motivated by profit. It was motivated by the desire to seek security, right? Or security for an oppressed people. And that's just not true, because many colonies were set up by oppressed people. So we can just look to our history in the United States. Many of the early English colonists were themselves religious dissenters and were subject to persecution in England. And so they came to the United States fleeing religious oppression, for example. I don't think the Puritans came to the United States seeking profit. They were seeking an ability to live as, according to their religion freely and live out their religious ideals. Nevertheless, they were colonists. They were colonists because of their relationship to the natives, right? They did not seek to integrate into native society. Rather, they built independent communities, right? And they did so without the consent of the natives. So Zionist colonization of Palestine, which is, by the way, is the term that Zionists used, right, came with the aim of creating a separate economy, a separate politics, a separate society from that of the native majority. And also, that's something that's not really well understood by most people, is that the only way they could successfully attract European Jews to immigrate to Palestine was to create this separate society and separate economy. Why? Because Palestine was poor, relative to Europe. So they ended up creating an exclusionary economy solely for the purpose to raise artificially the living standards of Jewish immigrants, because otherwise Jewish immigrants would not have wanted to go to Palestine because the standard of living was too low, right? So they had to that's what led to the creation of the Jewish National Fund, so to ensure that land acquired would be for the exclusive use of Jews, and even if it were rented to a Jew, the Jew were prohibited from hiring an Arab, because they had to segregate the Jewish economy from the Arab economy. Because if there was a free economy, Jewish wages would have gone down to that of the standard of the Arabs, and it would have been too low to attract Jewish immigration, right? So there was a very important economic dimension to the logic of Zionist settlement that required them to set up a separate economy, a separate institution, separate everything from their neighbors, right? And so that's what makes it a colony. They're doing all of this without the consent of the natives, right? When you immigrate, you adopt the laws of the new society and you integrate yourself into the existing institutions of the country in which you are immigrating. When you are a colonizer, you are creating new institutions and you are separating yourself from the natives, and you don't care whether they consent or not. And so Zionists clearly were indifferent to obtaining the consent of the Arabs, right? And so that's indisputable. That's why Zionism is colonialism.
And as you know, a common response to that, if I can just push back a little,
Mm-hmm.
is that, well, the Jews are the indigenous people, they've been there for thousands of years, and so they're really just coming home, and therefore this is not a accurate um, description of what's happening. Can you explain your response to that very common rebuke of analysis that Israel is a colonial?
Well, I mean, you can say anything you want about yourself, but that's just not legally relevant, right? First of all, it's mythology, right? Who knows where Jews in the Pale of Settlement came from? Who knows Ben Gurion's ancestry? That's all mythology, right? And public international law has well-known sources, right? And claims of descent from an ancient kingdom do not give rights of settlement or conquest or return or naturalization. Jews had a right to naturalize in Palestine pursuant to the Palestine Mandate and pursuant to the rules that the British promulgated for naturalization. But they also were bound by the other rules that existed, right? As I mentioned, when a Jew became naturalized, they swore an oath of loyalty to the government of Palestine. The government of Palestine was created by the Palestine Mandate. It contemplated a state in which a Jewish national home would exist within Palestine, an Arab majority state, right? Arabs were citizens of that state. So they had no natural right to expel fellow citizens, denaturalize them, confiscate their property, which is what they did, right? The Jewish state, as it exists, the Israeli state, expelled 2/3 of the Arab population, confiscated their properties, and then stripped them of citizenship. These are all grave violations of international law.
Okay.
And by the way, just one last thing. If somebody like Ben Gurion can assert that he's a returnee and he has a natural right to return to his home, well, that a fortiori applies to Palestinians who the Israelis expelled.
Right. It certainly would have repercussions, correct, if we want to be consistent based on 1948. And I'll just put another plug in to our audience of another report that's similar to the issue brief, which is called Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, that I authored with Mitchell Plitnick, who's a Jewish American political analyst who's also on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace. And so that leads me to another question that, again, it is focused on the U.S. context. So in your article, you're kind of in conversation with Ezra Klein's podcast, and you're going to prop him up as the an exemplar of a liberal Zionist. And then you also mentioned Professor Noah Feldman, who's at Harvard Law, and particularly an essay that Noah Feldman had written called The New Anti-Semitism, which is actually not a very new argument. Back in the 1970s, the Anti-Defamation League coined the new anti-Semitism because of the growing resistance or the growing opposition to Israeli colonialist practice in Israel against Palestinians and all of the things that are now heavily reported on in Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the United Nations. And so they called it the new anti-Semitism, which is essentially, if you criticize Israel, if you criticize Zionism, that is really anti-Semitism. And so what Feldman says, according, kind of you highlight, is he states that advocacy for Palestinian freedom is suspect and as anti-Semitic, or at the very least, anti-Semitic adjacent. And it's September, right, 25th, 2025. There is a genocide happening in Gaza. At least that has been the conclusion of, it's become a consensus almost of international legal scholars, increasing number, as time passes, increasing number of Holocaust and genocide study scholars, many of whom are Jewish American or of Jewish faith and Jewish identity, are also finding that what is happening in Gaza is a genocide caused by Israel. So how do, in light of that, how does your analysis or your research on Zionism help to illuminate this, what I think is a false conflation of Zionism and Judaism? Why has that continued to be the talking point of special interest groups that clearly their primary objective is to defend Israel as opposed to stop discrimination or hatred towards Jews?
I think there are two different claims here. One, there's a claim by Zionists that there's really no difference between Zionism and Judaism, right? Which I find really, really bizarre. Because historically, if anybody spends any time reading about the history of Zionism, one immediately discovers the fact that Zionism only became, let's say, popular among Jewish communities relatively recently. When it started, it was condemned as heretical, right? So for a long time, Jewish religious leaders condemned Zionism as heretical, and now they want to say that it's an integral part of Judaism. So that's completely an ahistoric argument. It's also an argument that I've suggested to some, in certain contexts on this question, that Jews themselves should be the first to reject, because Zionism's history is so problematic that you would think that you would not want Judaism to be associated with it because of this history of colonialization, ethnic cleansing, racially motivated denaturalizations, racially motivated confiscations of property, and now genocide. I don't think you want to say that my religion stands for these things, right? But, that's not my issue, right? The other issue, I think, which Professor Feldman is pointing to, I think is a real issue. But here, I think our diagnoses differ, although I'm not sure exactly what his not diagnoses, but his suggestion, his solution would be. He is arguing in that piece that the problem with focusing on Israeli atrocities is that a secondary effect of that is that it resurrects, it gives life to lots of anti-Jewish tropes, right? Traditional sources of anti-Jewish bigotry, right? And I'm kind of sympathetic to that because I see that in a lot of social media, where many people are turning against Israel, but turning against them in ways that resurrect anti-Jewishness. And so I understand where that fear is coming from. But what that tells me is what we need to do is, hold Israel accountable for its crimes. If we ensure that Israel is a law-abiding state, a state that acts in pursuant to justice, that remedies its wrongs, right? Then that will resolve this problem of anti-Semitism becoming a consequence of this conflict. The other point of view kind of seems to follow this logic. Well, we can't do anything about Israel, so we might as well shut up, because the more we focus on Israel, it's just going to recreate or give new life to anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Jewish bigotry, right? And I don't believe that Palestinians have an obligation to fall on their own swords to prevent the renewal of anti-Semitism, right? What we should do is compel Israel to be a law-abiding state. If it were a law-abiding state, Palestinians would have the rights secured, and Jews would be safe from anti-Semitism. So that's what we should strive to do.
No, I understand that argument. I think that I would push back a little in rejecting the position of Israel, which is that we are an exclusively Jewish state. I think well, my position is that it should not be an exclusively Jewish.
Well, obviously, I try, it cannot be a just state if it's an exclusively Jewish state, and that's the problem. That's the source of this new anti-Semitism. So the solution is not to close our eyes to Israel's manifest and continuing and ongoing illegality and unjustness. The solution is to reconstitute the state along lines that satisfy, basic principles of justice. Then Palestinians would have their rights secured, and we wouldn't have to worry about anti-Jewish bigotry as a reaction to Israel.
Yeah, but I also think that we need to be very clear that Israel does not represent all Jews in the world, should not represent all Jews in the world any more than Iran represents Muslims or Saudi Arabia represents Muslims. Iran Shia, Saudi Arabia Sunni.
100% correct, but here there is a kind of problem that Zionists create for Jews, because on the one hand they want to say that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic because of Judaism's because Zionism is integral to Judaism. But then they want to say that we aren't responsible for Israel's crimes, right? And so you kind of can't have it both ways. So if we accept that there's a distinction between the state of Israel and Jews, then we hold Israel accountable to norms of justice as set out in public international law, and we insist that Judaism is a religion, right? It is not a state. A state can be law-abiding. It could be non-law-abiding. Israel happens to be radically non-law-abiding, and that's the problem. And Jews should not be the collateral victims of Israel's illegality. But at the same time, if Zionists are claiming that Israel is such an indelible part of our identity, they are inviting people to hate Jews because of the injustice of Israel. And this is the tragedy of Zionism. As a colleague recently told me, the biggest source of anti-Semitism today is Israel's conduct. Legally, it's very important. Let me just say a little bit about the political significance. It just it gives added prestige to Palestine, and it contributes to the delegitimization of Israel, given that the more Palestine gains widespread recognition, the more fanatic Israel becomes in insisting there can never be a Palestinian state. So it increases Israel's isolation and U.S. isolation. And so that has significant political costs. It's also legally significant because international law is often incorporated in the domestic legal systems of most countries one way or the other. And so although I said as a Palestinian refugee doesn't have a private right of action against Israel or the United States, at least as far as I can imagine, there are lots of ways that public international law intersects with domestic international law. For example, the EU's trade agreement with Israel requires it to respect certain forms of human rights, etc. As more and more EU countries recognize Palestine, and Israel is insisting on rejecting the rights of Palestinians to self-determination, which is a peremptory norm of international law, as the ICJ recognized in its July 2024 advisory opinion, that's going to give legal grounds for suits on and challenging lots of EU policies vis-a-vis its relations with Israel. And Canada, the same thing, Australia, the same thing, and the UK, the same thing. So again, there will be legal consequences that are favorable for Palestine in the domestic legal systems of the countries that recognize it, as insofar because international law is incorporated in these domestic legal systems, right? So it is maybe a little too late for the Palestinians in Gaza, but as I was telling some friends recently, it's not as though if Israel succeeds in killing every single Palestinian that its problems go away, right? It will be held accountable one day or another, right? And the hope is that we can get the global community to act with sufficient alacrity to stop it from killing or expelling every single Palestinian. But genocide will never be a solution to Israel's political problems, namely that stem from the fact that Palestine is a multiracial, multi-religious jurisdiction in which Jews are a minority.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Fadel, for that informative and provocative and illuminating talk. It is consistent with the mission of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is to expose the public to experts and scholars who bring critical perspectives that center and are inclusive of the experiences, the history, the politics of Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and Palestinians. And I hope that people will read your article, Beyond Liberal Zionism. And again, may not agree with everything, but that is the objective of academic centers, is to be a platform for experts and scholars to bring forward their peer-reviewed analysis and scholarship and generate debate and conversations, because this is, for now, and we hope to do everything we can to keep it that way, a democracy. And part of CSR's work is to exercise free speech, to protect free speech and academic freedom by exercising it on a regular basis. And if this is something that you believe is important and is in fact under assault the way that we believe it's under assault, please donate to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. Our next event will be on October 9th, 2025, which will launch the second annual Humanizing Palestine lecture series. And the first lecture will feature Professor Karam Dana. So I encourage all of you to register for that event and attend. And with that, thank you so much, Professor Fadel, for your enlightening lecture.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.